The scent of cinnamon and apples hung heavy in the cold December air of Los Alamos, New Mexico territory, as Martha Dawson pulled the last pie from her ancient cast iron stove, her hands wrapped in threadbare cloth to protect them from the heat. She had never imagined herself in this position, standing alone in her small adobe house on Christmas Eve morning in 1883. A widow at 24 years old with nothing but a single perfect pie and the desperate hope that someone in town would pay enough for it to keep the bank from taking her home come January. Her husband Thomas had been dead 6 months now, killed by a rattlesnake bite while working their small ranch, and the money had run out 3 weeks ago. Martha set the pie on the wooden table and studied it with tired eyes that still held flecks of determination, despite everything life had thrown at her. The golden crust was perfectly crimped, the lattice work on top precise and beautiful, steam rising through the gaps and filling her small kitchen with warmth. This pie represented her last bit of flour, her final 3 apples from the tree Thomas had planted their first year of marriage, and the remainder of the sugar she had been hoarding. If she could sell it for enough, she might make it through January. If not, she would have to leave Los Alamos, leave the home she had built with Thomas, and return to her parents in Ohio in shame. She wrapped the pie carefully in clean muslin cloth, tucking the edges tight to keep the warmth in, and pulled her worn shawl around her shoulders. The walk into town was only half a mile, but the December wind cut through the New Mexico territory like a knife, and she had long ago pawned her heavy winter coat. As she stepped outside, she could see her breath in the air, and the mountains in the distance were dusted with snow that glittered in the morning sun. Los Alamos was busier than usual, with ranchers and cowboys coming in from the surrounding territory to celebrate Christmas with whatever entertainment the small town could offer. The saloon was already doing steady business, and the general store had strung up pine branches in an attempt at festive decoration. Martha walked past the buildings with her head held high, ignoring the pitying looks from the women who whispered behind their hands and the more calculating stares from men who saw a young widow as an opportunity. She had set up a small space outside the general store with the owner's permission, laying out a wooden crate as a makeshift table. The pie sat there, still warm, still perfect, and Martha stood beside it with a hand-lettered sign that read, "Apple pie for sale, $1." It was an outrageous price, she knew. Most pies sold for 25 cents, maybe 50 if you had a reputation as a baker. But Martha needed more than a few coins. She needed enough to buy supplies, to pay something toward what she owed to survive. She stood there as the morning stretched on, watching people walk past, seeing their eyes linger on the pie and then move to the price and then move away. Some shook their heads. Others laughed. One old woman actually stopped to tell Martha she ought to be ashamed of herself, charging such prices during the Lord's birthday season. By noon, Martha's hands were numb and her hope was fading. She had started to consider dropping the price when she heard the sound of spurs jingling on the wooden walkway. A man was approaching, tall and lean, with the bow-legged gait of someone who spent more time on horseback than on his own 2 feet. He wore dusty brown pants, a shirt that might have been blue once but had faded to gray, and a leather vest that had seen better days. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his face, but she could see a dark beard and eyes that seemed to take in everything around him with a quiet, watchful intelligence. Quincy Irving had been riding for 3 days straight, coming down from Colorado where a ranching job had dried up with the early winter. He was 30 years old, had been working cattle and horses since he was 14, and had never stayed in one place long enough to call it home. He had money in his pocket from his last job, enough to see him through the winter if he was careful, and he had been planning to spend Christmas alone in a boarding house room with a bottle of whiskey and his memories. But something about the woman standing in the cold with her pie made him stop. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with fancy dresses or careful styling. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her face was thin with worry and hunger, but her eyes were clear and determined. She stood straight despite the cold, despite the obvious poverty of her clothing, and there was something in the set of her jaw that spoke of strength and stubbornness. Quincy approached the crate and looked down at the pie. It was, without question, the finest pie he had ever seen. The crust was golden perfection, the lattice work showed real skill, and the scent alone made his mouth water. He glanced at the sign, raised an eyebrow at the price, and then looked at the woman. "That is a mighty expensive pie, madam," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He had not talked to anyone in days. Martha lifted her chin. "It is a mighty fine pie, sir, best you will find in the territory. You make it yourself, this morning, still warm." Quincy studied her for a moment, seeing the defiance in her eyes but also the desperation she was trying to hide. He had been hungry before, had been cold and alone and wondering where the next meal would come from. He recognized the look. "I will take it," he said, reaching into his pocket. Martha's eyes widened. She had not actually believed anyone would pay her asking price. "Truly, $1, you said?" Quincy pulled out a silver dollar and placed it on the crate, the coin ringing against the wood. Martha stared at the dollar like it was a miracle. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for it, and Quincy saw tears gathering in her eyes though she blinked them back fiercely. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what this means." Quincy picked up the pie, still wrapped in its muslin cloth, and the warmth of it seeped into his cold hands. He should have walked away then, should have taken his purchase and moved on like he always did, but something made him pause. Maybe it was the fact that it was Christmas Eve. Maybe it was the loneliness that had been eating at him for years. Maybe it was just the way she looked at him, like he had done something decent in a world that did not offer many opportunities for decency. "You get any breakfast today, madam?" he asked. The question seemed to startle her. "I beg your pardon, breakfast. You eat anything today?" Martha's cheeks colored slightly. "I am fine, thank you for your concern." "That is not what I asked." Quincy shifted the pie to one arm. "There is a cafe down the street. You should come have something hot to eat." "Sir, I do not even know your name." "Quincy Irving, madam. And I am not trying to be improper. I just figure if you are out here selling your last pie on Christmas Eve, you probably have not eaten in a while." He saw her stiffen and added quickly, "No offense meant. I have been there myself more times than I care to count." Martha looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something in his weathered face that made her believe him. This was not some man looking to take advantage. This was someone who understood. "Martha Dawson," she said quietly, "and yes, it has been a difficult time. Then come eat. Consider it a Christmas kindness. No strings attached, Mrs. Dawson. I see the ring." Martha touched the thin gold band on her finger instinctively. "I am a widow, Mr. Irving. 6 months now." Quincy nodded slowly. "I am sorry for your loss. The offer still stands. Just a meal between two lonely people on Christmas Eve." Something about the way he said it, the quiet understanding in his voice, made Martha agree. She was so hungry and so tired of being alone, and there was something solid and trustworthy about this strange cowboy with his careful manners and sad eyes. "All right," she said. "Thank you." They walked together to the small cafe, Quincy still carrying his pie, Martha clutching her dollar like a lifeline. The cafe was warm and smelled of coffee and frying bacon. There were only a few other patrons, mostly older men playing cards in the corner. Quincy chose a table by the window and set his pie down carefully before pulling out a chair for Martha. The gesture surprised her. Thomas had been a good man, but he had been raised rough and table manners had never been his strong suit. This cowboy, dusty and trail-worn as he was, had a natural courtesy that spoke of different upbringing. Quincy ordered coffee and bacon and eggs and biscuits for both of them, waving away Martha's protests about the expense. When the food came, he ate slowly, watching as Martha tried to maintain her dignity while clearly being ravenously hungry. She took small bites at first, trying to be ladylike, but eventually hunger won out, and she ate with the desperate speed of someone who had been skipping too many meals. "When did you last eat?" Quincy asked quietly. Martha swallowed a bite of biscuit. "Yesterday morning, some oatmeal. And before that, does it matter? I suppose not." Quincy poured more coffee for both of them. "Why were you selling the pie, if you do not mind my asking?" Martha was quiet for a moment, stirring sugar into her coffee. Then, perhaps because he was a stranger and she would likely never see him again, or perhaps because she was so tired of carrying everything alone, she started to talk. She told him about Thomas, about the ranch, about the rattlesnake and the doctor bills and the bank. She told him about being alone, about the small amount of money she had saved disappearing to necessary expenses, about the choice between eating and keeping the house warm. Quincy listened without interrupting, his dark eyes steady on her face. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What will you do? After January, I mean, if the bank takes the house." "Go back to Ohio, to my parents. They are good people, but they did not want me to marry Thomas. They thought he was beneath me, that I was throwing my life away on a poor rancher. Going back would mean admitting they were right." Her voice was bitter. "Were they right?" "No." Martha's response was immediate and fierce. "Thomas was a good man. He worked hard. We were building something together. It was not his fault a snake bit him. It was not his fault he died." Her voice cracked on the last word. Quincy reached across the table and very gently placed his hand over hers. The gesture was so unexpected, so tender, that Martha felt tears spring to her eyes. "You loved him," Quincy said simply, "with everything I had. Then they were wrong and you were right. Some things are worth more than money or security." He squeezed her hand once and then withdrew, seeming suddenly embarrassed by his own boldness. "I am sorry. That was too familiar." "No," Martha said, wiping at her eyes with her napkin. "No, it was kind. I have not had kindness in a long while." They finished their meal in companionable silence, and when Quincy paid the bill, Martha did not protest. Outside, the afternoon sun was already beginning its descent toward the mountains, and the air had grown even colder. Quincy walked Martha back toward where she had been selling her pie, still carrying the pie itself, and when they reached the spot, he seemed reluctant to say goodbye. "Mrs. Dawson," he said, turning his hat in his hands in a gesture that betrayed nervousness. "I know we just met. I know this is going to sound strange, but I have been thinking while we ate and I have a proposition for you." Martha felt her stomach tighten. Here it came, the real reason for his kindness. She had known it was too good to be true. "Mr. Irving, I am not that kind of woman, no." Quincy looked horrified. "No, madam, nothing like that. I meant a proper proposition. A business arrangement, you might say, though I hope it could be more eventually." He took a deep breath. "I am a good worker. I know cattle and horses. I have been drifting for years, never staying anywhere because there was no reason to stay. But I am tired of being alone. I am tired of wandering. And you need help. You need someone to work that ranch to make it profitable again, to help you keep your home." Martha stared at him. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "Marriage," Quincy said bluntly. "I know it is sudden. I know I am a stranger. But think about it practically, madam. You need help and I need a reason to stop running. We could help each other. I would work the ranch, make it pay. You would have security. And maybe over time we could become friends. Maybe even more." He paused, his weathered face flushing slightly. "I know I am not much to look at. I am 30, too old to be starting over, and I have nothing to my name but what I am wearing and about $40 in my pocket. But I am honest, and I am a hard worker, and I would treat you with respect. I would not press for anything you were not willing to give. I would sleep in the barn if you wanted." Martha felt like the world had tilted sideways. This man, this stranger, was asking her to marry him because he had bought her pie. It was insane. It was impossible. It was also, she realized with a start, the answer to every prayer she had been sending up to heaven for the past month. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do this for someone you do not even know?" Quincy looked out at the mountains, his expression distant. "I told you I had been hungry before. I did not tell you about being 12 years old and watching my mother cry because there was no food. I did not tell you about my father drinking himself to death because he could not provide for us. I did not tell you about becoming a drifter because I never learned how to stay in one place, how to build something permanent." He looked back at her. "I saw you standing here with that pie, so proud and so scared, and I saw my mother. I saw every person who ever needed a hand up and did not get one. And I thought maybe this was my chance to do something that mattered, to be someone who helped instead of just passing by." He paused, then added, "And if I am being completely honest, you are the first person in 10 years who looked at me like I was a human being instead of just another saddle tramp. That means something, Mrs. Dawson." Martha felt something shift in her chest. She looked at this strange, lonely cowboy with his careful manners and his honest eyes, and she made a decision that would have seemed crazy that morning. But it was Christmas Eve, and she was out of options, and sometimes miracles came in unexpected forms. "I loved my husband," she said quietly. "I need you to know that. I am not over losing him. I may never be fully over it. I would not expect you to be. And I will not be rushed into anything. If we do this, it would be a marriage in name only until I am ready for more. That could be months. It could be years. I understand. You would really work the ranch, make it pay." "I would work myself to the bone if that is what it took." Martha took a deep breath. "Then yes, Mr. Irving, I will marry you." Quincy's face broke into a smile, the first real smile she had seen from him, and it transformed him from weathered and worn to almost handsome. "You will not regret this, Mrs. Dawson. I promise you that." "I hope not," Martha said, and found herself smiling back. "I truly hope not." They were married the next day, Christmas morning, in the small church at the edge of Los Alamos. The preacher seemed surprised by the sudden wedding, but asked no questions beyond confirming that both parties were willing. Martha wore her best dress, which was not very good at all, and Quincy had cleaned up as best he could at the boarding house, shaving his beard down to neat stubble and brushing the trail dust from his clothes. There were no guests except for the preacher's wife as witness, and no celebration afterward except for the pie, which they shared in Martha's small house that evening. Quincy was true to his word, taking his blankets and sleeping in the barn that first night despite Martha's half-hearted protests that it was too cold. She lay alone in her bed, wearing her wedding ring on the opposite hand from Thomas's ring, and wondered if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life or the smartest decision. She fell asleep before reaching a conclusion, exhausted by the emotions of the past 2 days. The next morning, Martha woke to find Quincy already up and working. He had cleaned out the barn, which had been neglected since Thomas's death, and was examining the few pieces of equipment they owned with a critical eye. When Martha brought him breakfast, Bacon and eggs cooked with the supplies he had insisted on buying the day before. He ate standing up, too focused on planning to sit still. "The fences need mending," he said, chewing thoughtfully. "And we need cattle. How much land do you have?" 200 acres. Thomas filed the claim himself. Quincy whistled low. "That is good land. This soil with the river close by, we could run 50 head easy, maybe more. Do you have the deed in the house?" The bank was willing to wait until January because they knew they would get the land either way. "Not anymore." Quincy's voice was firm. "I will go into town tomorrow, pay what you owe, get the deed clear. Then we start building." True to his word, Quincy went into town the day after Christmas and paid Martha's debts with money that represented years of careful saving. Martha protested that it was too much, that she could not accept such a sacrifice, but Quincy was unmoved. "It is not a sacrifice," he said simply. "It is an investment, in the land, in the ranch, in us." The way he said the last word made Martha's heart beat a little faster. With the immediate financial crisis resolved, they fell into a routine. Quincy worked from dawn until well past dusk, mending fences, repairing the barn, making a list of supplies they would need come spring. Martha cooked and cleaned and started planning a garden, amazed at how quickly the house began to feel like a home again instead of a prison of memories. They were polite to each other, almost formal, but slowly they began to talk. In the evenings, after supper, they would sit by the fire and Quincy would tell stories about his years on the trail. He had worked ranches from Texas to Montana, had driven cattle across the plains, had seen storms and stampedes and all manner of adventures. He told the stories well, with a dry humor that made Martha laugh for the first time since Thomas died. In turn, Martha talked about her childhood in Ohio, about her parents and siblings, about the books she loved to read and the dreams she had carried west with her. Quincy listened with the same careful attention he gave to everything, asking questions that showed he was really hearing her, really interested in who she was beyond just the woman who needed his help. January passed, and then February. The worst of winter set in, snow covering the high peaks and cold winds sweeping down from the mountains. Quincy moved from the barn to the small storage room off the kitchen, claiming it was warmer, but really, Martha suspected, because she had asked him to. It seemed foolish for him to freeze in the barn when there was space inside, even if it meant he was sleeping only a few feet from her own bedroom. One night in late February, a particularly fierce storm hit, the wind howling around the adobe house and rattling the shutters. Martha woke to the sound of something crashing in the yard and stumbled out of bed to look. Through the window, she could see that part of the barn roof had torn loose and was flapping wildly in the wind. Quincy was already up, pulling on his boots. "Stay inside," he ordered, reaching for his coat. "You cannot go out in this. If that roof goes, we lose the barn. I have to secure it." He was out the door before Martha could protest further. She stood at the window, heart pounding, watching as Quincy fought his way through the storm to the barn. She could barely see him through the driving snow, just a dark shape struggling against the wind. Minutes passed like hours. She was about to pull on her own coat and go after him when the door burst open and Quincy stumbled inside, covered in snow and bleeding from a cut on his forehead where flying debris had struck him. "You are hurt." Martha rushed to him, helping him out of his frozen coat. "It is nothing." But he swayed slightly, and Martha caught his arm. "Sit down before you fall down." She guided him to a chair by the fire and went for her medical supplies, the same kit she had used trying to save Thomas. Her hands shook slightly as she cleaned the cut on Quincy's forehead. It was not deep, but head wounds bled profusely and he looked pale under his tan. "Did you secure the roof?" she asked, dabbing at the cut with a clean cloth. "Best I could. It will hold until morning." Quincy winced as she applied some salve. "You are good at this." "I had practice." Martha's voice was tight. "I could not save Thomas, though. All the practice in the world, and I could not save him." Her voice broke on the last word, and suddenly she was crying, great heaving sobs that she had been holding back for months. All the fear and grief and exhaustion came pouring out, and she buried her face in her hands, shoulders shaking. Quincy stood up, ignoring his dizziness, and very gently pulled Martha into his arms. She stiffened for just a moment, then collapsed against his chest, crying like her heart was breaking. He held her carefully, one hand stroking her hair, murmuring soft words of comfort. "It is all right," he said quietly. "Let it out. You have been so strong for so long. Let it out." Martha cried until she had no tears left, until she was just hiccuping against Quincy's shirt, which was soaked with her tears and melted snow. Slowly, she became aware of where she was, of the strong arms around her, of the steady beat of his heart under her ear. She pulled back slightly, looking up at his face. "I am sorry," she whispered. "Do not be." Quincy's hand came up to cup her cheek, his calloused thumb wiping away the last of her tears. "Do not ever be sorry for grieving someone you loved." They stood there for a long moment, close enough that Martha could feel the warmth of his body, could see the kindness in his dark eyes. Something shifted between them, something subtle but profound. This was not just a business arrangement anymore. This was not just two lonely people helping each other. This was becoming something real. Quincy seemed to sense it too. He leaned down slowly, giving Martha plenty of time to pull away, and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. "You should get some sleep," he said softly. "It has been a long night." Martha nodded, not trusting her voice. She went back to her room but did not sleep for a long time, too busy thinking about the feeling of being held, of being comforted, of not being alone. The next morning they did not speak of what had happened, but something had changed. They were more comfortable with each other, less formal. Quincy started touching her casually, a hand on her shoulder as he passed, helping her with her coat. Martha found herself doing the same, straightening his collar, brushing snow from his hair. Small gestures, but intimate in their own way. March came, bringing the first hints of spring. The snow began to melt, revealing brown grass that would soon turn green. Quincy made a trip to Santa Fe, taking most of their remaining money, and returned with 10 head of cattle and a milk cow. It was a start, he said. They would breed them, build the herd slowly, do it right. Martha started her garden, turning the soil and planting seeds. Quincy built her a better chicken coop and bought 6 hens and a rooster. Slowly, the ranch began to look like a working operation again. One evening in early April, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and pink, Quincy said, "I want to tell you something." Martha looked at him, noting the serious expression on his face. "What is it?" "I am falling in love with you." He said it simply, directly, the way he said everything. "I know we agreed this was just an arrangement. I know you are not over Thomas, and maybe you never will be completely. But I needed you to know how I feel. You do not have to say anything back. I just wanted to be honest." Martha's heart was pounding. She looked at this man who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer, who had worked himself ragged to save her home, who had been patient and kind, and never pushed for more than she was willing to give. She thought about Thomas, about the love they had shared, and felt the familiar pang of loss. But she also felt something new, something growing slowly in her chest like the seeds in her garden beginning to sprout. "I do not know if I am ready to love again," she said slowly. "I do not know if I can, but I care about you, Quincy, more than I expected to. You have become important to me. You have become my friend and maybe, eventually, something more." "That is enough," Quincy said and reached for her hand. They sat there as darkness fell, hands linked, watching the stars come out one by one. The next few weeks felt different. There was a new awareness between them, a growing tension that was not unpleasant but was definitely present. Martha caught herself watching Quincy as he worked, admiring the strength in his shoulders, the competence of his hands. She noticed the way his eyes followed her around the room, the way he smiled when she laughed at his stories. One night in late April, after a long day working together to repair more fencing, they were both tired and dirty and satisfied with what they had accomplished. Martha heated water for baths, and Quincy took his turn in the kitchen while she waited in her room. When it was her turn, she soaked in the warm water, feeling her muscles relax, and found herself thinking about the man in the other room. She had been a wife before. She knew what happened between a man and a woman. With Thomas, it had been sweet and simple, two young people figuring things out together. She wondered what it would be like with Quincy, this older, more experienced man who had seen so much of the world. The thought made her blush, but it also made her feel something she had not felt in a long time: desire. When she emerged from her room in her nightgown and robe, her hair loose around her shoulders, Quincy was banking the fire for the night. He looked up and froze, his eyes widening slightly. Martha had never come out of her room dressed for bed before. She had always stayed inside until she was fully dressed in the morning. "Martha," he said, her name sounding different in his rough voice. She walked toward him, her heart beating fast but her steps steady. "I have been thinking," she said. "About what? About us, about this marriage." She stopped in front of him, close enough to touch. "It has been 4 months. You have been so patient, so kind, never asking for anything." She reached up and placed her hand on his chest, feeling his heart beating as fast as her own. "I think I am ready to be a wife again, a real wife." Quincy's hand came up to cover hers. "Are you sure? I do not want you to feel obligated. I meant what I said about being patient. I am sure." And she was. It felt right, this next step. Thomas would always have a place in her heart, but there was room for Quincy too. Room for this new love that had grown slowly but steadily, like grass after winter snow. Quincy leaned down and kissed her, and it was nothing like the chaste kiss on her forehead from months ago. This was deep and searching, full of months of restrained desire. Martha kissed him back, her arms going around his neck, and felt herself melting against him. He pulled back slightly, breathing hard. "Are you certain?" "Yes. Take me to bed, Quincy." He did, lifting her in his arms and carrying her to the bedroom she had slept in alone for so long. They made love slowly, carefully, Quincy taking his time to learn what she liked, to make sure she was with him every step of the way. It was different from what Martha remembered with Thomas, more intense, more knowing, but it was good. It was very good. Afterward they lay tangled together, Martha's head on Quincy's chest, his arms around her. "I love you," he said quietly into her hair. Martha thought about it, about the feeling in her chest that had been growing all these months. It was not the same as what she had felt for Thomas, but that did not make it less real. "I love you too," she said, and realized it was true. "I really do." Spring turned to summer and the ranch flourished. The cattle multiplied and Quincy sold some of the calves for a good profit. Martha's garden produced abundantly, and she started selling vegetables and eggs in town, building a reputation as a reliable supplier. They hired a young man from town to help with the heavy work, and Quincy began to talk about expanding, about buying more land. In July, Martha realized she was pregnant. She told Quincy one evening after supper, nervous about his reaction. They had not talked about children, had been too focused on survival and then on their growing relationship. Quincy's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, fear, and then pure joy. "Truly," he asked, his voice cracking slightly, "truly, I think I am about 2 months along." He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. "A baby," he whispered. "Our baby." Then he pulled back, looking worried. "Are you all right? Should you be working? Should you be resting?" Martha laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. "I am fine. Women have babies all the time while working ranches, but maybe you could take over the heavier chores. Anything. Whatever you need." Quincy was grinning like a fool, and it made Martha's heart swell with love for him. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Martha felt well, better than she had any right to, considering how sick she had been when she was first widowed and starving. Quincy was attentive to the point of being overprotective, constantly worrying about her, making her rest, doing more than his share of the work. Martha tolerated his fussing because she knew it came from love. In late December, as Christmas approached again, Martha went into labor. It was exactly a year since she had stood in the cold selling her last pie, since Quincy had walked into her life and changed everything. The irony was not lost on her as the contractions began. Quincy rode to town for the doctor, pushing his horse hard, terrified that something would go wrong. Martha, left alone with the midwife they had hired, found herself thinking about Thomas, wishing he could have seen her this happy, this settled. But she also knew that Thomas would have wanted this for her, would have been glad she found someone to love again. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next morning. Quincy paced outside the bedroom, useless and terrified, listening to Martha's cries and feeling helpless. When the baby finally came, a healthy boy with strong lungs and dark hair, Quincy was allowed in to meet his son. Martha lay exhausted but triumphant in the bed, holding the baby wrapped in soft blankets. She looked up as Quincy entered, and the expression on his face made her smile. He looked awestruck, terrified, and completely in love all at once. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Quincy approached the bed like he was walking on holy ground. He looked down at the tiny face, the small hands, and felt something in his chest crack open. "He is perfect," he whispered. "He is ours," Martha said and held the baby out to him. "Hold your son, Quincy." Quincy took the baby with shaking hands, cradling him carefully against his chest. The baby settled immediately as if he knew he was safe. Quincy sat down on the edge of the bed, unable to take his eyes off the child. "What should we name him?" Martha had been thinking about this. "I want to name him after your father. What was his name?" "Robert." Quincy's voice was thick. "Robert James Irving, but he was not a good man, Martha." "I do not think we should. Then we will give him the name and pray he becomes the man your father could have been. Robert Thomas Irving, after both our fathers. Maybe he can redeem the name." Quincy looked at her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Robert Thomas Irving, it is perfect." "You are perfect. I do not know what I did to deserve you." "You bought my pie," Martha said with a tired smile. "You bought my pie and you saved my life." "No," Quincy said, leaning over to kiss her forehead while still holding their son. "You saved mine. The years that followed were good ones." The ranch continued to grow, expanding as Quincy and Martha worked together to build something lasting. They added more cattle, bought the neighboring property when it came up for sale, built a bigger house with multiple bedrooms and a real porch that wrapped around the front. Robert was joined 2 years later by a sister, Grace Martha Irving, who had her mother's dark hair and her father's steady temperament. Another son followed 3 years after that, James Quincy Irving, who was wild and rambunctious from the moment he could crawl. Martha proved to have a gift for business, keeping the accounts and negotiating prices with the buyers who came from as far away as Santa Fe for their prime cattle. Quincy became known throughout the territory as a fair dealer and an expert horseman. Together, they built one of the most successful small ranches in New Mexico territory. But more than the success, more than the money or the land or the growing reputation, what mattered was that they were happy. They worked side by side every day, fell into bed exhausted every night, and woke up grateful for another day together. They learned each other's moods and habits, developed private jokes and shared dreams. They argued sometimes, usually about money or how to handle the children, but they never went to bed angry. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Quincy bought Martha a new wedding ring, a proper gold band with a small diamond. She wore it on her left hand, but she never took off Thomas's ring, moving it to her right hand instead. Quincy never asked her to. He understood that loving him did not mean forgetting Thomas, and he respected her too much to demand otherwise. On their 10th anniversary, they threw a party and invited the whole town. The ranch house was full of laughter and music and dancing. Their children ran wild with the other kids, stuffed full of cake and excitement. As the evening wound down and the guests began to leave, Quincy and Martha stood on their porch, watching the sun set over land that was truly theirs, earned through sweat and love and determination. "You ever regret it?" Quincy asked, his arm around Martha's waist. "That day." Agreeing to marry a stranger, Martha leaned into him, thinking about the scared, desperate woman she had been, standing in the cold with her last pie. She thought about everything that had come after the hard work, the joy, the children, the life they had built together. "Not for a single second," she said. "You were the best thing that ever happened to me." "You were standing there so proud," Quincy said, his voice soft with memory. "So scared but trying not to show it. I knew right then I wanted to be the one to make sure you never had to be that scared again. You kept your promise. You have kept all your promises. So have you." Quincy turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I came to Los Alamos with $40 and no reason to keep living. You gave me everything: a home, a family, a purpose. You made me believe I could be more than just a drifter. You made me believe I deserved to be happy." Martha reached up to cup his face, looking into the eyes she had come to know so well. "We saved each other," she said simply. As the stars came out above them, the same stars that had witnessed that desperate Christmas Eve so many years ago, Quincy pulled Martha close and kissed her. Inside the house, their children were settling down for the night. The ranch hands were finishing the last of the chores, and the cattle were quiet in the pastures. Everything they had built, everything they had become, had started with one pie and one lonely cowboy's decision to buy it. Robert, their oldest son, grew to be a strong young man who loved the ranch as much as his parents did. He learned everything Quincy could teach him about cattle and horses, and everything Martha could teach him about business and fairness. Grace became a teacher, opening a small school in Los Alamos and teaching the children of ranchers and townspeople alike. James, true to his wild nature, became a lawman, using his energy and his father's sense of justice to keep the peace in the growing territory. As New Mexico moved toward statehood, Quincy and Martha moved toward old age, still working the ranch but gradually letting Robert take over more of the responsibilities. They became the respected elders of Los Alamos, the couple who had built something out of nothing, who had started with desperation and turned it into prosperity. On Christmas Eve of 1913, exactly 30 years after that fateful day when they met, Martha made a pie. Her hands were older now, marked with age spots and the scars of decades of work, but they were still steady. She used the same recipe, apples and cinnamon and sugar, crimping the crust with the same care she had shown that desperate winter morning. The family gathered for Christmas dinner. Robert with his wife and 3 children, Grace with her husband and twin daughters, James with his new bride. The house was full of noise and laughter and love. After the meal, Martha brought out the pie and set it on the table. "Your mother made this," Quincy said to the assembled family, "because today is a special anniversary." 30 years since you got married?" Robert asked. "No, that was yesterday. 30 years since I bought a pie from a beautiful woman and made the best decision of my life." Martha cut the pie, serving everyone, but she saved the last piece to share with Quincy. They sat together on the porch despite the cold, wrapped in blankets, sharing the pie and watching the stars. "You remember what you were thinking?" Martha asked. "That day when you saw me?" Quincy was quiet for a moment, remembering. "I was thinking that you looked like hope, like maybe there was still something in the world worth stopping for. I had been drifting so long, Martha. I was so tired. And then I saw you and I thought maybe here, maybe now, maybe her." "I was terrified," Martha admitted. "When you proposed, I thought you were insane. A stranger asking me to marry him because he bought my pie." "It was insane," Quincy agreed, laughing. "Completely crazy. Best crazy thing I ever did." "Best crazy thing we ever did," Martha corrected. She leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steadiness that had been her anchor for 3 decades. "I would do it all again, you know. If I had to go back, if I had to choose, I would choose you every time. Even knowing how hard it would be. All those years of work and worry, especially knowing that. Because I also know how it turns out. I know about the love and the children and the life we built. I know that the scared widow and the lonely cowboy figured out how to be happy." She looked up at him, her eyes still bright despite the wrinkles around them. "We did good, Quincy Irving. We did very good, Martha Dawson Irving." He kissed the top of her head. "We did very good indeed." They sat there until the cold drove them inside, finishing their pie and talking about everything and nothing, comfortable in the silence between words like only people who have spent decades together can be. Inside, their children and grandchildren were cleaning up, the sound of their laughter drifting out through the windows. As they prepared for bed that night, moving through the familiar routine with the ease of long practice, Martha paused to look at the photographs on the dresser. There was one of their wedding day, both of them looking young and uncertain. Another of the whole family taken just that morning, 3 generations gathered together. And in the back, a small photograph of Thomas, taken before Martha had even known Quincy existed. "You ever talk to him?" Quincy asked softly, coming to stand behind her. "To Thomas, I mean." "Sometimes," Martha admitted. "I tell him about the children, about the ranch. I think he would be happy for me, for us. I hope so. He gave me a gift when he died, even though he did not know it. He loved you well enough that you knew what love was. You knew what you deserved. That made you brave enough to take a chance on me." Martha turned in his arms, this man who had been her husband for 30 years, who had been her partner and friend and lover through everything life had thrown at them. "I was not brave," she said. "I was desperate and you were kind. But we took that desperation and that kindness, and we made something beautiful." They went to bed holding each other as they had for thousands of nights before, warm and safe and grateful. Outside, snow began to fall softly, covering the ranch in white, the same ranch that had once been Martha's prison and had become their kingdom. The years continued to pass. Quincy and Martha grew older together, their hair turning white, their movements slower but their minds still sharp. They watched their grandchildren grow, saw some of them take to ranching and others move to the cities that were springing up across the now state of New Mexico. They survived droughts and good years, watched the world change with automobiles and telephones and all manner of modern conveniences. But through it all, they remained constant to each other. Every Christmas Eve, Martha baked a pie, and every Christmas Eve, Quincy would pretend to consider buying it before declaring it was the finest pie in the territory. It became a family tradition, a reminder of how their story began, of the miracle that could happen when desperation met kindness on a cold December day. When Quincy fell ill in the winter of 1925, weak and fading at 72 years old, Martha never left his side. She held his hand and told him stories about their life together, reminding him of all the good years, all the love they had shared. Their children gathered around the bed, saying their goodbyes, but Martha was the one who stayed through the long nights, keeping watch. "I am sorry to leave you," Quincy whispered one night, his voice barely audible. "Do not apologize," Martha said fiercely. "You gave me 42 years. You gave me everything. You have nothing to be sorry for. I wish it could be longer. So do I, but Quincy, listen to me." She leaned close so he could see her face clearly. "You saved my life. That cold Christmas Eve when I had nothing left, you gave me hope. You gave me a future. You gave me love when I thought I would never feel it again. Whatever time we have had, it has been a gift. Every single day has been a gift." Quincy managed to smile. "You saved mine too. Remember that. When I am gone and you are sad, remember that you made me happier than I ever thought possible. You gave meaning to a life that had none. You were my home, Martha, my only real home." He died 2 days later, peacefully in his sleep with Martha beside him. The funeral was huge, people coming from all over the state to pay their respects to a man who had become a legend in the ranching community. But Martha barely noticed the crowds. She stood by his grave and said her own private goodbye to the lonely cowboy who had bought her pie and changed her life. After Quincy's death, Martha lived another 8 years. She stayed on the ranch, helped by her children and grandchildren, still baking pies and tending her garden even as her body grew frail. She talked often about Quincy, keeping his memory alive, making sure the grandchildren who had never met him knew what kind of man he was. On Christmas Eve of 1933, 50 years exactly since she had stood in the cold selling her last pie, Martha felt tired in a way that went beyond her physical body. She had baked a pie that morning, her hands shaking with age but still remembering the motions. That evening, surrounded by 4 generations of family, she told the story one last time about the desperate widow and the lonely cowboy, about the pie that cost $1 and the proposal that came with it, about the crazy decision that led to a lifetime of love. "Remember," she told them, her voice soft but clear, "that sometimes miracles come in unexpected forms. Sometimes salvation comes from strangers. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is accept help when you need it and offer it when you can." That night, Martha went to sleep in the bed she had shared with 2 husbands, 2 different kinds of love, both real and lasting in their own ways. She did not wake up. Her children found her in the morning, peaceful and still, a small smile on her face. They buried her next to Quincy, under the big cottonwood tree at the edge of the property, with a view of the mountains and the ranch they had built together. The headstone was simple. Martha Dawson Irving, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother. She made the best pie in the territory. The ranch stayed in the family, passed down through the generations. Robert's children ran it after he retired, and their children after them. The house was expanded and modernized, but the original adobe structure remained at its heart, preserved as a reminder of where it all began. The story of Martha's pie and Quincy's proposal became family legend, told and retold to each new generation, a reminder of their heritage and the power of love and kindness. In the town of Los Alamos, The cafe where Quincy had bought Martha her first meal eventually became a restaurant that specialized in pie. The current owner, a distant descendant of the Irving family, kept Martha's original recipe and baked it every day. Above the counter hung an old photograph, faded but still clear, showing a young woman with determined eyes and a man with a kind face, standing together in front of a small adobe house. And every Christmas Eve, without fail, someone in the family baked Martha's apple pie. The recipe had been written down and preserved, passed from mother to daughter, father to son, a tangible link to the past. As they crimped the crust and arranged the lattice work, they thought about the woman who had been desperate enough to sell her last pie for $1, and the man who had been kind enough to buy it and offer her everything he had. Because in the end, that was what the story was really about. Not just about love, though there was plenty of that. Not just about survival, though that was part of it too. It was about two people who found each other when they needed it most, who built something lasting out of loneliness and fear, who proved that sometimes the best things in life come from the most desperate moments. The ranch still stood as the 21st century dawned, a working operation that had weathered over 100 years of change. The Irving family still lived there, still raised cattle and horses, still gathered for Christmas Eve and baked Martha's pie. And when they told the story to their children, they made sure to emphasize the important parts, that love can come from unexpected places, that kindness to strangers matters, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is say yes to something that seems crazy, that a single moment of connection can change the entire course of a life, and that a pie, baked with the last of everything you have, can become the foundation of a legacy that lasts for generations. Martha's recipe card, yellowed with age and stained with decades of use, was kept in a frame in the ranch house kitchen. Her handwriting, neat and careful, listed the ingredients and instructions. But at the bottom, added years later in different ink, was a note in Quincy's rougher hand. The secret ingredient is hope, and maybe a little bit of crazy. Mostly love, though, definitely love. And that, more than anything else, was the truth of their story. It was a love story that began with desperation and kindness on a cold Christmas Eve in 1883, in a small town in New Mexico territory, when a widow baked one pie to sell, and a lonely cowboy bought it and asked for her hand too. Everything else, the ranch, the children, the legacy that lasted over a century, grew from that single moment of connection between two people who needed each other more than they knew. The pie was just a pie. But it was also a symbol of everything Martha had left, everything she was willing to risk. And Quincy's purchase was just a transaction. But it was also an acknowledgement that she mattered, that her struggle mattered, that she deserved help and hope and a future. From those simple elements, a great love grew, the kind of love that builds dynasties and changes lives and echoes down through the generations. On ranches and in towns across New Mexico, the story was still told, modified and embellished by time, but true in its essentials. The desperate widow, the lonely cowboy, the pie that brought them together, and the love that sustained them through everything that followed. It was a story about the Old West, about survival and hardship and the kind of people who built something out of nothing. But it was also a timeless story about human connection, about the courage it takes to trust a stranger, about the transformation that can happen when two lonely people decide to take a chance on each other. In the end, that Christmas Eve in 1883 was not just the beginning of Martha and Quincy's story. It was the beginning of something that would outlast them both, a legacy of love and family and perseverance that would echo through the ages. All because a widow baked one perfect pie, and a cowboy with kind eyes and a lonely heart decided to buy it and offer everything he had in return. And if that is not a Christmas miracle, then nothing is.